The royal guards kept hurting the Runts. The Alpha King's human mate slaughtered everyone. She had learned to pour his tea the way he liked it. Black, scalding, brought to the left side of the throne dais at the exact moment the morning light hit the crystal panels of the eastern wall. Not a second earlier, not a second later. The Velthara were precise about such things, and imprecision had consequences she had seen demonstrated twice in her first month here and had not needed to see a third time. Jenna Barnes set the cup down without looking at Corshun's face. She had gotten very good at that, at occupying the space around a thing without meeting it directly, the way you learn to walk the edge of a cliff in the dark, aware of the drop, every nerve calibrated to it, but not looking down. "Your scent is different this morning," he said. She kept her hand steady. "I slept poorly." He made a sound like water cracking inside a stone, amusement, or something that functioned similarly. She had catalogued 47 of his sounds over 14 months and still wasn't sure which ones were safe. "The young ones were fighting in the sublevels again," he said. "The Runts." She had heard it. Through the walls of the gilded chamber they called her quarters, a room the size of a tennis court, hung with silk the color of dried blood, with windows that didn't open. She had heard the sounds that passed for fighting among the palace's lower caste Velthara. High-pitched, rhythmic, like metal struck repeatedly in a very specific pattern that she had eventually understood was communication as much as violence, a social grammar written in pain. "They keep hurting the young ones," she said, because silence was also noticed. "It is how rank is established." Corshun lifted the cup with 2 of his 4 upper limbs and drank without looking at her. He had 6 limbs total. 4 arms arranged in 2 pairs along a torso that bent like a question mark, 2 legs that functioned as such only when he chose to use them, thick and joint-heavy, ending in feet that splayed when he stood. His face was a flat plane of dark chitin with 4 eyes arranged in a slight curve, the 2 outer ones slightly larger, used for peripheral threat detection, she'd been told, and a mouth that split vertically rather than horizontally. When he smiled, which he did rarely, it looked like something being carefully broken. He was, by every measure his species applied to such things, extraordinarily beautiful, the Alpha King, Supreme Velthara, commander of 7 systems, conqueror of 3, the being who had reached across the diplomatic table 11 months into the integration accords and selected her, Dr. Jenna Barnes, xenobiologist and accidental delegate, to serve as his bonded mate. She had said yes because the alternative had been demonstrated immediately prior, when the delegate from the Martian colonial authority had said no, and was no longer present. 14 months, she had counted everyone. "The Varkith arrives today," Corshun said. The word landed with the particular weight of things not being asked, only announced. The Varkith was his high commander of palace forces, a Velthara elder of such seniority that even Corshun's guards straightened when the name was spoken. "You will remain in the residential wing." "Of course," she said. She walked back through the throne room, 700 square feet of polished black mineral that rang faintly when she stepped on it, like a bell being asked a question, and through the corridor beyond it, and into the smaller passage that led to the research annex, which was where she spent most of her permitted hours, which was the only reason she was still alive in any meaningful sense. They had given her work. That had been Corshun's concession to her species' particular psychological needs, which the Velthara had studied with the same thorough dispassion they applied to everything. Humans, their research showed, deteriorated without purpose. They required occupation. So they had given her occupation. The cataloging and translation of biological samples from 17 human-occupied worlds, forwarded to Gem Research Station, the palace annex they'd named in a gesture toward accommodation, for her analysis and annotation. She had been doing this for 14 months. It was only in the last 3 that she had begun to understand what she was annotating. The research annex was staffed by 4 other beings, 2 Velthara lab technicians of sub-royal caste, a composite entity called Marvin who communicated via text panel, and whom she was almost certain was the most intelligent person in the building, and Liz. Liz was human. She had arrived 6 months after Jenna, assigned as what the Velthara called a parallel research asset, which Jenna had eventually understood meant a second opinion they hadn't bothered to tell her they were seeking. Liz had been a genomics researcher at University of Edinburgh before the integration. She wore her hair in a tight braid and had a habit of pulling a single thread loose when she was working through a problem, winding it around her finger until the knuckle went white. Her knuckle was white now. "How much did you figure out?" Jenna asked, settling onto the bench across from her. Liz didn't look up from the sample display. The light from it turned her face the color of an old bruise. "More than they think I did." She paused. "The alkaloid compound in sample set 17. "I know. It's not a disease vector, Jenna. It's a primer." Jenna had known this for 6 weeks. She had been sitting with it for 6 weeks, turning it over in the careful, very quiet part of her mind she had learned to reserve for things she was not ready to act on yet, because acting too early was how you ended up like the Martian delegate. "It bonds to human reproductive tissue," she said, keeping her voice flat. "Changes the expression markers. Prepares it." Liz finally looked up. "For a specific kind of fertilization, cross-species. This isn't a research annex, Jenna, it's a breeding lab." The word landed between them like something dropped from height. Jenna had been pregnant once before, during her 3rd year of graduate school, and had not continued the pregnancy, and had never particularly thought about it as a formative moment until she was 14 months into being the bonded mate of an alien king, and 6 weeks into understanding that her continued presence here was predicated on becoming something she had never once agreed to become. "The Varkith," she said. "Arrives today. Yes, I know." Liz pulled the loose thread tighter. "I heard the guards talking last night. The Varkith is here to assess the program's progress. If we haven't," she stopped. "Then we become a different kind of sample," Jenna finished. Marvin's text panel flickered. She glanced at it. 3 words, the system logs. She looked at him for a moment, this composite entity whose physical form was a gentle suggestion of limbs around a central processing node, who had been assigned to assist their research and had been doing something else entirely the whole time. "You've been monitoring." "Since the beginning," the panel read. "I did not know how to tell you. I did not know if you would want to know. Humans sometimes prefer the comfortable version." "We don't," Liz said. "We really categorically do not." "Then you should know," Marvin wrote, "that the North Corridor Service Tunnel connects to the sub-level atmospheric systems. The Velthara guards do not patrol it because the atmospheric pressure there is aversive to their chemoreception. To human olfactory systems, it is merely unpleasant." Jenna looked at the panel for a long time. Then she looked at Liz. "How far along is the alkaloid bonding in your samples?" Liz met her eyes. "They haven't administered it to me yet. I think I'm scheduled for next week." A beat. "You." 8 weeks ago," Jenna said quietly. "I didn't know what it was." The silence between them was a particular kind, the kind that sits in the chest and doesn't move. "Okay," Liz said, and pulled the loose thread loose completely. The emergency happened before they were ready, which was how emergencies worked. Jenna had known this professionally, intellectually, the way you know things that haven't happened to you yet. The lab's alarms were not alarms in any human sense. They were a subsonic pulse that the Velthara felt in their chitin, and that Jenna felt as nausea, a full-body wrongness that arrived without warning at 1400 hours on a Tuesday, or what she calculated as a Tuesday, and changed everything. The first thing she did was drop her sample tray. This was not tactical. It was a pure animal response, the startle reflex, the same thing that made humans flinch at loud noises and still had not been selected out despite 10,000 years of civilization. The tray hit the floor and the samples she'd been annotating scattered, and she stood there for 3 seconds breathing, reminding herself what her hands were for. The second thing she did was look at Marvin. Lockdown protocol, the panel read. Origin point, sublevels, a guard has been killed. Her mind did something very fast and very cold in that moment. She had exactly 2 reactions available to her, and she chose the one that kept her moving. Who killed the guard? Unknown. The lower caste workers were present, the runts as Caution calls them. A pause, one of them is missing. She knew the word for what Caution would do. She had heard it used 3 times in 14 months, and each time the being it was used about had become a historical fact rather than a present entity. They'll purge the sublevels. And anything that could have been in contact with the sublevels. Liz had appeared at the lab door, eyes bright with something that was not panic, because panic was the luxury of people who still had time to be afraid. The guards are sealing the research annex. I know. Jenna, Liz stepped closer, lowered her voice to something that barely existed. I've heard what happens during a palace lockdown. They don't sort, they just clear. Marvin's panel, the North Corridor Service Tunnel. You have perhaps 6 minutes before the guard rotation seals the atmospheric junction. 6 minutes. She had cataloged biological samples from 17 worlds. She had learned to pour tea precisely. She had said yes to something she had not chosen, and survived it for 14 months by being exactly what they expected her to be: calm, compliant, curious, useful. And she had measured out her aliveness in tablespoons for over a year, and she was not going to measure it out in anything smaller than that. Get your coat, she told Liz, and whatever shoes you wore today better be flat. They are, Liz said. I stopped wearing heels 6 months ago. She paused. I didn't know why at the time. Jenna thought about that. Sometimes the body knows before the mind arrives. Marvin, she turned to the panel. Can you get us the tunnel access? Already open, he wrote. I have also introduced a 40-second delay into the guard rotation scanner. Not long. Enough. Come with us. The panel was quiet for a moment. Then, I am the system. I cannot separate from it, but I will keep the internal communications looped long enough for you to reach the junction. Go now. She wanted to say something to him that was worth saying. There wasn't time for anything that was worth saying. She said, thank you, which was small and true, and moved. The North Corridor smelled like ammonia and something older, organic in a way that suggested the building's infrastructure was more biological than she'd previously understood, which was a thought she filed away for later, because right now the only thing that mattered was the width of the tunnel narrow. She and Liz moved single file, shoulders brushing the walls, and the sound of her own breathing and the distant percussion of the palace going into a different mode, something she felt more than heard. The way you feel whether before it arrives. She had killed 2 people. This was the thing that kept arriving. The first had been a lab technician named Kreth, who had found her examining the alkaloid compound documentation 3 weeks ago and had reached for the emergency alert panel on the wall. She had hit him with the sample centrifuge. She had not known she was going to do it. She had been holding the centrifuge, and he had been reaching for the panel, and her arm had moved, and afterward, she had stood in the lab looking at him for a long time, and then she had moved him behind a storage unit, and gone back to her documentation, and spent the rest of that day, and most of the night in a state of careful, operating dissociation that she recognized later as a coping mechanism her brain had developed entirely without her permission. The second had been 6 days later, when Kreth's absence had been noted, and a senior guard named Velpreth had come to the annex to question her. He had been respectful. He had been professional. He had also been very clearly deciding something about her based on her answers, and she had watched the decision reach his eyes, 4 of them, outer ones widening slightly, which she had learned meant alert, which meant threat assessment, which meant imminent, and she had used the thing Marvin had quietly shown her 3 months ago when she'd asked him, very casually, what the Velthara nervous system's primary vulnerability was. She had asked it as a xenobiological question. He had answered it as one. The junction between the second and third pairs of limbs, where the nerve bundle clusters before distributing to the lower body. A hard, precise strike. She had used her elbow, which was the densest bone in her arm, and which she had not previously thought of as a weapon. Velpreth had gone down. She had used the emergency kit's sedative patch on him because she didn't know how long she had, and she had hoped that would be the end of it, and it had not been. I've killed 2 people, she thought, moving through the tunnel. 2 people, 2 beings, whatever the word was. Liz behind her, are you still with me? Yes. Your breathing changed. I'm fine. I didn't say you weren't. A pause, the sound of their footsteps on the service flooring, which was metal mesh over a long drop into the atmospheric processing system below. I'm asking because I need you to stay present. We can spiral later, when we have a place to be. Jenna breathed. There's a being named Marvin back there who just gave up his only chance to tell us what he was. I know. He was kind. Yes, Liz's voice was very steady. He was, we'll carry that. Right now, keep moving. The junction was a hatch about 3 feet square set into the tunnel wall at a point where the atmospheric chemistry became actively unpleasant, something sulfurous and sharp that made both their eyes water. Jenna found it by feel as much as sight. The hatch's locking mechanism was Velthara design, a pressure-based sequential system, but Marvin had cycled it open, and what was on the other side was a vertical shaft with rungs set into the wall going down. Down. She looked at Liz. How far down? Liz asked. Sublevels. Where the runts are. Where the runts were, Jenna said, and where I think some of them might still be. Liz looked at the hatch, looked at her. The guard that was killed, one of the lower caste workers killed a royal guard. Yes. A runt killed a royal guard. They've been hurting them for a long time, Jenna said. Eventually you hurt something enough times and it stops flinching and starts calculating. She went through the hatch first. The sublevels were not what she'd imagined, which in retrospect meant she'd been imagining something derived from human architecture applied to alien context, a failure of category she was supposed to be professionally above. The sublevels were not a dungeon. They were a network of functional spaces, atmospheric processing, biological waste reclamation, storage of the less aesthetically pleasing infrastructure elements that kept a palace running. And within and around and between these functional spaces, the lower caste Velthara had made something that was not quite living quarters and not quite a settlement and was unmistakably home. She stood at the base of the shaft and looked at it for a moment. The small objects arranged on ledges, the markings on the walls that she had learned enough of the lower script to recognize as names, the sleeping areas partitioned by hung fabric in colors that shouldn't have worked together but did. The runts, Korshan called them. The sub-caste who ran the palace's physical plant and were compensated in the currency of not being hurt as much as they could have been. She heard sound, stopped. Movement around the curve of a processing unit the size of a city bus. She held very still, and Liz, who had come down the shaft a step behind her, held still too, and what came around the curve was a young Velthara. 12, maybe 14 in their equivalent years. She wasn't entirely sure, with a bad injury to 2 of its upper limbs, bound in what looked like strips from the same hung fabric she'd seen on the partitions, and eyes that went wide when they saw her. All 4 of them. Including the outer ones, which meant threat assessment, and then something happened she hadn't seen in 14 months of watching Velthara faces. The outer eyes narrowed instead of widening. Not threat. Recognition, something more careful. It made the sound for her name. Not her name as Korshan said it, which was always slightly wrong, a transliteration that treated her name as a designation. This was her name as she'd said it once, months ago, to a lower caste maintenance worker she'd passed in the corridor, and offered a hand gesture of greeting that no one above her rank had ever offered any of them. She had not known that anyone had remembered. "Hello," she said, in the language she'd spent 14 months learning until it stopped feeling like translation and started feeling like thinking. "My name is Jenna. I need to know if there's another way out." The guard's name had been Velpreth, not the one she'd sedated, a different one, assigned to the sub-level access point, who had made a habit, based on what the young Velthara communicated to her in urgent, injured bursts, of a particular cruelty toward the lower caste workers that exceeded even the palace's standard tolerance. The runt who had killed him was named Korishit, which meant literally stone persistence in the old dialects, and she was currently hiding in an atmospheric reclamation chamber 200 meters south with 2 others who had helped her. The lockdown had sealed the palace. The Varkith was somewhere above them, his arrival coinciding with the crisis in a way she was beginning to understand was not coincidental. The breeding program assessment and the palace lockdown occupying the same day was the kind of thing that didn't happen by chance, that happened when someone wanted a controlled environment for a thing that required a controlled environment. She was not going to think about what she understood that to mean yet. Later, after. The young Velthara, Jenna, had decided to call him Keth in her head, short and easy to remember, led them through the sub-level in the careful, low-to-the-ground movement of someone who had learned very early to be invisible in the spaces between things. She and Liz followed. The sounds above them were changing. She had learned to read the palace's acoustic geography over 14 months, the way voices and movement and mechanical systems translated through the building's mineral walls, and what she was reading now was a systematic progression. Room by room, level by level. Moving downward. "They're coming through the residential levels," she told Liz quietly. "How long to reach the sub-levels?" She listened, 20 minutes, maybe less. Liz's jaw set. "What's the plan?" Marvin said the atmospheric junction. I think he meant more than just a way out. I think he was telling us what the Velthara can't follow us through. She paused. The atmospheric systems run all the way to the palace exterior. They have to heat exchange, oxygen cycling. If the atmospheric pressure is aversive to their chemoreception all through the tunnels, then anyone pursuing us is going to be navigating partially blind. Partially blind is not fully blind. No, she looked at Keth, but we have a guide who knows these systems. Keth looked at her for a moment with his outer eyes slightly narrowed, which she was beginning to read as the sub-caste equivalent of careful attention, of being seen. Then he made the sound that meant yes in the dialect of the lower levels, which was different from the sound it meant in the court registers, rougher and more definitive, a sound that didn't leave room for negotiation. She had not heard that sound in 14 months. She had missed it enormously. The Varkith found them in the atmospheric processing corridor, level 3, which was either a failure of her timing or a success of his, and she never entirely resolved which. He was old. She had not expected that, had been constructing in her mind some version of a high commander that skewed toward the physically imposing. But the Velthara aged differently, the chitin thickening and darkening until the oldest among them were almost black, and he was nearly black, and he moved with the deliberate economy of a being that had not had to hurry in a very long time, because the universe had learned to wait for him. He had 6 guards with him. Royal guards, full caste, in the ceremonial armor that was less ceremonial than it looked. She had seen it demonstrated once, when a dissident human delegate had tried to rush the throne, and the guards had moved in a coordinated sequence that was fast enough and precise enough that she had thought, for a detached professional moment, that she was observing something close to a distributed intelligence. The Varkith looked at her. He looked at Liz. He looked at Keth, and his expression changed in a way she didn't have full vocabulary for yet, but the outer eyes went wide. "The human made of caution," he said in court register, perfect and cold, "and the breeding asset, and the sub-caste child. He paused. All three together in the service tunnels. Another pause. Interesting. She said nothing. She had learned that the pause before violence often looked like conversation. You understand, the Varkith said, that there is no version of this circumstance that does not end with you return to your designated spaces. The breeding protocol requires your presence. The king's bond requires your compliance. He tilted his head in the small arc she had learned meant condescension. You are small. You are singular. You are, if I am honest, and I find I have nothing to lose by honesty in this moment, somewhat remarkable for your species. But remarkable is not sufficient. I know, she said. He seemed almost surprised. Then you understand why. I know, she repeated, that you believe that. The Varkith was quiet for a moment. I've been here for 14 months, she said. The corridor was narrow and the guards were arranged in 2 groups of 3 on either side of the Varkith, and the atmospheric chemistry in here was making all of them slightly off balance. She could see it in the way their limbs compensated, small postural adjustments, the outer eyes working harder. She was the only one who wasn't being affected. I've spent 14 months being told what I am. Small, singular, a research asset, a breeding asset, a mate object. She kept her voice even, the way she'd kept her hands steady bringing tea to the left side of the throne dais. I've been annotating biological samples that were actually your preparation of my body for something I never agreed to. And I've been doing it quietly, because I was calculating. The Varkith made the sound for amusement, slow and certain. Calculating what? She had the environmental toolkit from the atmospheric maintenance station 20 meters back. She had been carrying it for 6 minutes without drawing attention to it, because she had learned 14 months ago how to hold things without drawing attention to them, and she had apparently been practicing for this. How many of you I could take, she said, and threw the first canister before he finished processing the sentence. It was not elegant. She wanted to be very clear about this, even only to herself, in the part of her that was still running the dispassionate observation track she'd relied on her whole professional life. It was not skilled or tactical in any practice sense. It was a xenobiologist who had spent 14 months learning every physical vulnerability of one species, and its palace infrastructure throwing a pressurized atmospheric compound at 6 highly trained guards in a narrow corridor, while a sub-caste child who had killed a royal guard threw something else from the other side. The compound hit the guard nearest to the Varkith at the nerve junction she'd learned from Marvin, which was not a coincidence because she had been aiming for exactly that. He went down. The second canister was Liz's. She had grabbed it without being asked, which told Jenna something about Liz's own quiet months of preparation. And it went into the guard cluster on the left, and the atmospheric compound did what it did to Velthara chemoreception at close range, which was functionally what a flashbang did to human vestibular systems. Not fatal, not permanent, but immediately and comprehensively disorienting. 3 guards down or staggering, 3 remaining, the Varkith himself. She moved toward the Varkith, which was not what anyone expected, because no one expects the small thing to move toward the apex predator, which was exactly why she did it. He had 4 arms, 2 were already reaching for her. She went under them, under the lower pair, which was reaching slower because the atmospheric compound was getting into his receptors too, and she used her elbow at the nerve junction, and she used her knee at the joint complex, and she used 6 months of thinking about this moment and all the weight of what he had been a part of building, the breeding program, the primer compound, the gilded room with the windows that didn't open. The Varkith hit the floor. She was breathing very hard. Her hands were shaking. She did not know when she had started shaking. Jenna, Liz's voice from behind her, 3 left. She turned. 2 of the remaining guards had Liz at the corridor wall, and the 3rd was moving toward Keth. And there was a moment, a specific, elongated moment that she would think about later in the way you think about the exact second before something breaks, where she understood that she was making a choice that was not strategic, not calculated, not informed by any professional framework, but by something older and simpler than any of that. She picked up the Varkith's personal weapon, which had fallen when he did. She had never touched a Velthara weapon before. It was heavier than it looked and warm, which surprised her, and she didn't know how to fire it, but she knew what pointing it at something meant in every language she'd ever encountered. "Let her go," she said, and stepped back from the child. The two guards holding Liz exchanged a look. She watched their outer eyes, alert, threat assessment, calculating. She watched them arrive at the same question she'd been waiting for them to arrive at. Is this being capable of using that weapon? She didn't know if she was capable of using it. She was very sure that she was capable of making them uncertain about whether she was capable of using it. And she had learned in 14 months of living among a species that ran on dominance hierarchies that uncertainty was the most dangerous thing you could introduce into a dominance hierarchy. Because dominance hierarchies were built on the premise that everyone knew their place, and the moment someone stopped knowing their place, the whole architecture trembled. They let Liz go. She kept the weapon trained, and they stepped back from Keth, and she said, in the lower register she'd been practicing for 6 weeks in the privacy of the research annex, the rougher dialect the sub-caste used, the one that didn't leave room for negotiation. "Sit down." They sat. She had never heard the corridor this quiet. Keth knew 2 more ways out. He showed her both. The first was a maintenance access that connected to the palace's exterior heat exchange vents, which opened on the northeast face of the structure. The second was a service vehicle bay in the lowest sublevel, used for waste reclamation, with a loading ramp that extended to the outer perimeter road. She chose the second because it was flat, and Liz had gone quiet in a particular way that she recognized from the early months of her own arrival. The way the body went quiet when the mind was in overload, working through something it hadn't integrated yet. Corishit was there, in the service bay. She and the 2 others who'd helped her were behind a reclamation unit, watching the humans come down the ramp with the measuring attention of beings that had learned not to trust easily and were currently reassessing. Jenna stopped in front of Corishit and looked at her. The injury to her upper limbs had been dressed more carefully now. Someone had taken time with it, used something for antiseptic, even here, even with everything. "You killed a royal guard," she said in the lower register. Corishit met her eyes. He was hurting the small ones. "I know." A pause. "They always hurt the small ones. They have always hurt the small ones. And nothing." Her voice did something Jenna didn't have a name for yet, some quality of rupture. "Nothing ever changed." "It changed today," Jenna said. The outer eyes narrowed. Not threat assessment, something else. Something she didn't have a word for in either language and didn't need one. "The loading ramp," Jenna said. "Can you drive what's in this bay?" Corishit looked at the vehicles. "I maintain them." "Then yes." "Yes," Corishit agreed. Korshin was in the vehicle bay when they reached the ramp. She hadn't planned for this. She had planned for guards, for pursuit teams, for the Varkith recovering and raising an alert. She had not planned for Korshin himself. Standing at the base of the loading ramp with 4 guards arranged behind him, and his face doing something she had never seen it do in 14 months. The flat chitin plane of his features arranged in an expression she had no category for because she had never seen him uncertain before. He looked at her for a long moment. "You knew," he said, "about the program." She waited. "For how long?" 6 weeks, she said. "That I knew what it was. 3 months that something was wrong, a beat. 14 months that I was not here by choice." Something moved through his expression. She watched it. The outer eyes did not widen into alert. They stayed at neutral, which she had never been able to read precisely, because neutral was not an expression Korshin used often. He was always in a state of something, command, satisfaction, the particular settled authority of a being who had never questioned his own centrality to any situation. He was not in that state now. The bond, he said, it is not the way my species forms bonds is not the same as he stopped. He started again. I was told that humans acclimate, that they adapt. We do, she said. We're very good at it. She kept her hands at her sides, the Velthara weapon in her right hand visible. That's not the same as consent. Silence. The Varkith's program, he said. It was not a question. It was a man, a being, who was beginning to add things up and not liking the total. I was told the research annex was for xenobiological cataloging. It was also that, she said, and a breeding laboratory. Your Varkith has been running a cross-species reproductive program on me and Liz for months. I was administered a primer compound 8 weeks ago without my knowledge. She said it simply, without weaponizing it, because she was too tired to weaponize it, and also because she wanted him to hold the weight of it himself. The outer eyes went wide, alert. She had seen that expression aimed at threats at subordinates who had overstepped at the Martian delegate before he became historical. She had not seen it aimed inward, at a thing inside his own palace, a thing done in his name. The Varkith, he said very quietly, exceeded his authority. Yes. In my name. Yes. His 4 upper limbs moved in a sequence she had never catalogued, something she didn't have a name for either, a movement that suggested the Velthara equivalent of a deep, bracing breath. Then he looked at the guards behind him and made a sound she had heard used twice, and both times the being it was aimed at had become historical. The 4 guards stood down. She stared. I am not asking you to stay, he said, turning back to her. The uncertainty was still there, more visible now, a crack in the architecture that went all the way through. I cannot undo what has been done. The compound, he faltered. I would provide medical assistance if you would accept it. She thought about this for a full 5 seconds. I'll need Marvin's system access, she said. Full access. The research annex documentation, the breeding program files, everything. I want all of it. Done. And Korishit and the others with her. They're not to be punished. His gaze moved to the young Velthara, to Korishit with her bound arms. The guard she killed was hurting children, Jenna said. Document it that way. Another long pause, then done. And Marvin, she said, whatever that entity is, whatever their status in your system, I want them reclassified, fully. They showed more care for human life in this building than anyone with authority. Korshin was quiet for a long moment. You negotiated all of this, he said slowly, with a weapon you don't know how to fire. I know how to point it, she said. That's usually enough. Something happened on his face that she recognized at last, after 14 months. She had seen it before, in humans, in moments when something small and persistent surprises something large and certain into revising itself. It looked the same in chitin as in skin. He was reconsidering something. She didn't know exactly what, and she didn't have the luxury of caring yet. Later, after. She and Liz left through the loading ramp. Korishit drove. She and the 2 others sat in the front of the vehicle, a broad, low platform designed for waste hauling that smelled like the atmospheric tunnels, and moved with a deliberate, unhurried certainty that suggested its operator had decided on a speed, and was not going to be argued out of it. Jenna sat in the back. On a reclamation bin she'd turned on its side, and held the Velthara weapon in both hands and watched the palace recede in the vehicle's rear optical panel, which was not quite a window but functioned as one. The palace was still on lockdown. Emergency lights on the exterior, the particular amber-red wavelength the Velthara used for crisis states, which she had learned was at the lower end of their visible spectrum, and therefore highly visible to them, the way human red lights were highly visible to humans. She watched it go. 14 months, 424 days, approximately 10,000 hours. I'm pregnant, she said. Liz, sitting beside her, didn't react with surprise. She'd known, probably, in the way colleagues who work close together know the things the other person hasn't said yet. How long? I think 8 weeks, the alkaloid compound. It wasn't a natural conception. No. Liz's hand found hers. They sat with that for a moment, in the back of a waste hauler moving away from an alien king's palace in the amber-red light of a crisis. Both of them covered in things she didn't want to catalog, both of them still breathing. There are options, Liz said, whatever you want. I know, a beat. I don't know what I want yet. That's allowed. The vehicle crested a rise, and the palace dropped below the horizon line and was gone. She thought about Marvin, somewhere in the system, running his loops, maintaining his access, caring in the small, persistent way of entities that couldn't leave and chose to help anyway. She thought about Corishit, in the front of this vehicle, driving at exactly the speed she had decided on, going somewhere none of them had specified yet, because the where was less important than the direction. She thought about 14 months, about tea brought precisely to the left side of the throne dais, about windows that didn't open, about annotation work that was actually something else, about what it felt like to understand something too late and what it felt like to do something about it anyway. She thought about the fact that she had walked into that corridor with a canister of atmospheric compound and no training, and every bit of knowledge she'd accumulated in 14 months of being exactly what they expected her to be. And she had pointed a weapon she couldn't use, and 6 royal guards had sat down. Humanity was not the strongest thing in the 7 systems. She knew this. She had known it since the integration accords, since the demonstrations that accompanied the diplomatic table, since the Martian delegate. Humanity was not the most advanced, was not the most numerous, was not, by any physical measure, the most equipped for survival in a universe that appeared to have been built for things larger and stranger and older than them. But humanity had 14 months of patience and 6 weeks of calculation, and a xenobiologist who had learned to pour tea precisely, and a genomics researcher who had stopped wearing heels without knowing why, and a sub-caste child who had learned that if you hurt something long enough it stops flinching and starts measuring the gap between your ribs. And humanity had a very old habit, older than civilization, older than language, older than any diplomatic table, the habit of being underestimated, of being called small, of being told that remarkable is not sufficient, of sitting with that quietly and calculating anyway. She looked at the road ahead. The vehicle's headlights cut through the alien dark, and somewhere, in the direction they were going, was a communication relay station that Marvin had included in his system access notes 3 weeks ago in a sub-file she wasn't supposed to have access to and had read twice and memorized completely. Humanity had been quiet for 14 months. It had some things to say. She settled the weapon in her lap and looked at the road and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like exactly what she was. Not a mate object, not a research asset, not a breeding asset, not a delegate or a symbol or a managed problem. A scientist, a woman, a human being who had done the math and was ready to show her work. The amber-red light of the palace was gone. The stars above them were the same ones she'd been looking at since childhood, rearranged, but there, still there. Corishit made a sound from the front of the vehicle. She didn't know the word, but she knew the register, questioning, forward-aimed, the sound that meant, "Where are we going?" Jenna Barnes, 14 months a prisoner and now something else entirely, looked at the relay station coordinates in her memory and pointed north. "Forward," she said, in the lower dialect, the one that didn't leave room for negotiation. And they went.